So Moses here with w.a.production, and in this video we're going to be taking a little look at how we can create loud, pumping sounds that really stand up to a commercial level and compete with our favourite artists that release tracks on the top 100 charts. Now, we're not going to be aiming for -1 LUFS levels with this or anything stupid, and this is all to be taken with a pinch of salt and to be used in correspondence with the type of music you're making. Never push something too loud just for the sake of it being loud. You know, that's not what we're trying to do here. However, I found that when I was starting out making music, I found it really difficult for my tracks to match up to the pro standards, and a lot of that comes from 5 very simple techniques which we'll be employing throughout this video. They are sound design, saturation and distortion, high frequencies, space and limiting, and both of these can be applied on single tracks as well as bus processing. So we'll take a look at how we can create loud sounds that respond really well to a master and stand up against any commercial track that you might put it against. So without further ado, let's hop into Ableton and get the project started. I'll just give a quick run through of the track we're going to be working to, and as you can see I have Isotope's Insight open, and we'll have this open throughout the whole video just so we can see how the loudness levels are affected by what we do. So as you can hear, it's a pretty raucous kind of drum and bass aggressive track. Now this is a track that lends itself very nicely to being really pushed to the limit with these different techniques, and it's through doing drum and bass that I kind of learnt my craft with how to create sounds that just sound really big and massive. So to start off with, we'll take a look at the first one on the list, which is sound design. So I have our lead sound soloed here, and I'll just play it through so you can hear what it sounds like with all the processing turned on. And you can see that on the LUFS we had about -17 on the short term. Now I'm going to turn all these effects off and we'll have a listen to it without the distortion and the loudness processing, so to speak. So as you can hear, this sound is pretty basic, and if you open this up as a preset you'd be pretty disappointed. However, with all the processing turned on, suddenly it comes alive and really explodes through the speakers. So something that I think is really crucial when we're designing our loud sounds is to be thinking from the ground up how we're going to make this sound loud and pop. And one way that I quite like to do that is to have distortions running while I'm creating the sound, because it can make you kind of come up with things that you might not normally come up with. So you can hear that with the sound just turned on as well, we have a pretty low LUFS meter reading. Now this isn't going to be very helpful, even if the sound was a good sound to begin with on the preset. This wouldn't be very helpful when we come to mixing and mastering, because we have to crank it up so much that we kind of almost would lose sight and we wouldn't actually be able to get the end loud result. However, when we turn on all these distortion and saturation units, as well as the limiter, suddenly we have a much higher LUFS reading. And now obviously don't just slam your sounds to -1, that's not going to be very good and you'll end up with this really super crushed and distorted mix. But it's just good to think about when we're making loud sounds to kind of keep the LUFS meter up and see how the sounds and how the design of the sounds is affecting the loudness. Now, as well as sound design, it is crucial to have a lot of saturation and distortion to achieve these kind of results. Now, I personally think that saturation is really overlooked, especially in typical education that we get for music production. I think it's one of the key reasons why sound has a character and why we get the energy that we want to out of most sounds. So for this track I was actually using w.a.'s Berserk Distortion, which is an absolute unit of a plugin. You can hear that when it's turned off and when it turns on, it just brings this annihilation to the sound. Now obviously this is in a bit of an extreme example where I'm using a highly crushed effect on the sound, but you can also use these things in moderation just to provide a bit of colour and a bit of extra grunt to your sounds. Another really key thing about saturation that you'll notice is when it's turned off, we're actually clipping the levels here, but when we turn it on, we have some really aggressive soft clipping and hard compression and limiting going on. Now this is also great because it means that we can create these really loud sounds which actually sit quite low in our mix and give us more gain and more volume to work with in the actual mix session. If I just had this preset alone playing, you'll see that I'm going to have to turn these levels down. And then we're sitting very low on the LUFS meter readings. Whereas with this, we can have the volume on the fader set to 0 with the Berserk distortion turned on. And the sound is just way more present and active whilst also giving us lots of headroom to work with, which is absolutely essential when we're creating a loud mix. Now next on the line is just Ableton Saturator and a limiter. Now these aren't doing that much. They're mainly just providing a little bit of colour and gain and kind of maximisation to the sound. However, the really key thing here that we've got is actually our own plugin, w.a.Production's The King, which is a multi-band compressor, and I'll just open that up for us now. We'll hear the difference with it on and off. The main reason I'm using this is just to bring out some of the high ends. I think high frequencies are sometimes overlooked when we're trying to create loud mixes. By adding high-end energy, we can kind of fake to our ears that there's more happening, more energy going on, and that something is more present in the mix. This is a really useful tip, however, it's not to be taken lightly. You know, if I increase this high gain here, you want to find the balance between it being too harsh and overpowering and too muffled. So now that we've looked at the individual channel of the bass, we're going to be taking a quick look at the bass bus, and you can see some of the plugins that I have active open on the screen. Now obviously we can be quite extreme with our saturation and distortion processing on the individual sounds. However, I also like to apply subtle saturation on the buses that I use. This helps to kind of glue the sounds together, adds in a little bit of soft clipping, again giving us headroom, and also just adds a little bit of colour and niceness to the sound. So you can also see here that we have a Pro MB running with some sidechain compression as well as an Ableton compressor, just going from our kick, just giving some sidechain and ducking on those important moments. And this also helps, especially when you're making big EDM style genres, because the drums do need a lot of space to work, and so does the bass. And rather than cramming all of these sounds into one area, you know, we can create some separation using some subtle sidechaining. This is quite a basic trick, and I recommend checking out some of our other videos where we focus a bit more on how to get the most out of your sidechain compression. So even though the drums aren't on, you can hear that they are slightly ducking, but not too much. This is another reason why I love Pro MB, because a lot of the time when you do sidechain, you don't want to have the whole sound be removed, because again, you know, a lot of the snare and a lot of the kick don't fill up the same frequencies where the bass power is, and some of the bass energy is in the kind of mids and highs. So by having a multi-band sidechain running, you can kind of create a lot more control just in the regions where you really need it to duck. So I'll show you what that sounds like with the drums on. You can see how it just helps give a little bit of space and room to those drum hits. And now the AFS levels do drop a little bit, but it's good to sacrifice here because you get more clarity on your mix, which more dynamics as well, which to our ears sounds like a better, louder and punchier mix. If you just had everything just hitting it hard the whole time, then you're going to lose all the dynamic sense, and it's going to be a bit pointless even having it that loud, because people are just going to have to turn it down, and our ears won't hear the balance difference between the quiet and the loud parts, which is another big thing which helps us create loud, powerful mixes, having contrasting sections, not just everything be like at maximum for the whole time. And now moving on to Fabfilter Saturn, I think Fabfilter Saturn is probably one of the best plugins for this. I don't think any other saturations units do it quite as well. Now you notice that I am on Saturn 1, I do have Saturn 2, but when I was making this song I hadn't actually upgraded to the new one. If I could, I would probably be using Saturn 2 on this right now, but just for safety's sake I thought I'd use the thing that I actually made the track with. So you can see that on Fabfilter we have loads of different saturations mode, and with Saturn 2 this has been expanded even more. The thing that I like to keep it on is gentle saturation and just with a little bit of drive, and we'll see the levels when I turn this on and off. So this is off. So that was sitting about -10 short term, and we were kind of peaking a little bit over there. So now I'll turn it on. You can hear that when it turns on, it just glues the sound together a little bit and also brings down the headroom on our main bass bus, which again is really helpful because it means that we can then kind of crank up a bit more towards the master. You notice as well that it didn't have much effect on the LUFS, and really when we're using bus kind of saturation, we don't want to have too much of a kind of sonic impact, because we'll be colouring all the sounds together as one. You know, when I have a bass bus running, I have my sub bass, mid bass, and also some bass flicks going in there, so I don't necessarily want the sub bass to become super distorted, because then we'll lose all our low end sub quality. You'll then notice that there is a limiter here, but it is turned off. I felt that with it on, it was just a bit too extreme. But of course we can limit buses, and that's something we'll be looking at now with the kind of drums bus that I have running. So now we're in the drum group. I'm not going to focus too much on the individual sounds here, because you'll see that the kick and the snare, they just have some saturation running, some pretty basic stuff, and then they're going into their own little bus with the Ableton glue compressor running. The main thing we're going to be focusing on here is our drums bus. Now, there's a few things that I really like to think about with this, and that's having parallel channels going on with the drums, having another Saturn, and also having some limiting. I don't worry too much about really heavy processing on my drums channels, because I try and aim to get the best sounds to start with rather than fixing them in the mix. Obviously some sounds will need some carving with EQ, but I find that the best way to get a really loud pumping mix is to choose samples that really work with the music that you're going to work with. You know, don't choose a massive fat 808 if you actually need quite a short, transient, punchy kick. Especially for drum and bass, we do want shorter samples to allow the bass to move, just because of the tempo of the track. So it's important to bear that in mind when you're writing your music, to just select the right samples for the job that you're doing. So I'll just play the drums through for you, and I've turned off a lot of the processes that we've got going on, and we'll see that even just to begin with, they're already sitting quite high in the LFS meter readings. Something else you'll notice as well is that they are clipping quite aggressively, which is again something that's going to be helped with all the processing that we put on. I find digital clipping can sometimes not be that bad, although you do want to be really careful not to have it completely riding in the red all the time, especially if every channel's in the red and the whole mix is just compressed and condensed. It's not going to sound very good. So definitely keep an eye on it and make sure that you can fix any problems that might happen with compression, limiting, and all those kind of things. Something that I love Ableton for, and something that is very special and unique to Ableton, is the way that it can handle parallel audio groups inside its audio effects tracks. So on the first channel we just have the drums with no compression, and then on the second one we have a compressor that's letting out the initial transients. Just kind of helps bring up the initial thwack and like kind of smack of the sound. And then we have another Berserk distortion just running parallel here. You can really hear the difference that just those two channels make in just boosting the sound up and giving it some extra characteristics. What I'm doing with the distortion is adding overtones and harmonics that we don't actually hear in the main drum kit, and with the parallel compression, just bring out transients so they really slap more in your face, and again, help us provide a louder end result from our sound. Then next up we just have the Fabfilter Saturn, again running in a very similar way to how we have the Saturn running on the bass bus, with just some gentle saturation and nothing else really going on. And you can see how already that's brought down our clipping level, given us lots of headroom to work with, so we can then push the mix back up into a cohesive thing. It's also given us a little bit of glue, as it did with the bass bus. Something else that I really like Saturn for is the fact that we can have this dynamic control here. So if you really wanted to, it kind of gives you a little bit of extra control over the dynamics of the sound. And then just lastly here on this bus, we just have a limiter. And this is just catching some peaks and again, maximizing that sound. So you can see that even though all these things are very little, very incremental things, apart from obviously with the main Berserk on the main sound, we can use very simple techniques to create these loud sounds. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated, and it doesn't need to absolutely shatter our sound into a million pieces. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's given you some insight how to create loud, banging sounds for your mixes. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell to be notified for more videos, and drop a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts and how you approach creating loud sounds and getting your mixes nice and poppin'. Until the next one, peace out.